Chapter 1. The Last Lecture. It was raining the morning Elliot Crane retired. Not a steady rain, but the kind that can't decide whether to fall or hover, soft enough to be invisible, heavy enough to make you close your collar. He stood by the window of his small campus office, watching the students hurry past, their umbrellas blooming like small, defiant planets. He thought, they move so fast, as if life were a train they're always late for. The clock on the wall ticked with the patience of old wood. He had stopped hearing it years ago, but that morning it sounded louder, as if marking not time, but endings. Elliot. He turned. It was Dean Monroe, still wearing that perpetual expression of managerial sympathy. The man had perfected it. "You sure you don't want to give a farewell talk?" the dean asked. "We could arrange something in the auditorium. Faculty, students, a little reception." Elliot smiled faintly. A reception for what exactly? The dean shifted, uncomfortable. "For your years of service. Your contribution to the department." "Ah," Elliot said, turning back to the window. "Yes, my contribution." The dean tried to laugh. "Come on, Elliot. Don't be dramatic." "I'm not," he said softly. "I'm just remembering." Monroe waited for a beat, then nodded, patted the doorframe, and left. The kind of exit reserved for people you don't quite know what to say to. Elliot looked around the room. 40 years of teaching had reduced itself to boxes, papers, notes, a broken mug, a calendar from 2007 still pinned on the corkboard. He ran his hand over the desk. The grain of the wood was rough beneath his fingers, worn smooth in the place where his wrists had rested all those years. He thought of his students, not the hundreds whose names he'd forgotten, but the few who'd lingered after class, asking questions that were really confessions. "Professor Crane, do you ever feel like it's all meaningless?" "Yes," he had answered once. "But I've learned to enjoy that feeling." He smiled at the memory. That student, what was her name? Sarah? Susan? Had looked horrified at first, then strangely comforted. That was the gift he'd offered, not certainty, but comfort. By noon, his things were packed. Outside, the rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet books and the faint, metallic promise of snow. He left his keys on the desk, closed the door, and stood in the empty hallway. "Goodbye," he whispered. Not to anyone, just to the sound of his own footsteps. He walked home the long way, through the campus gardens and past the library, whose bricks glowed dark in the damp. A group of students were gathered on the steps, laughing. One of them called out, "Hey, Professor Crane." He turned. It was Mark from his last seminar. Bright kid, restless, going somewhere. Mark asked, "Home? Retiring, huh?" "Apparently." Mark grinned. "Lucky man. I'd kill to retire." Elliot smiled. "Give it time. The world will help you." The boy laughed, not understanding, and turned back to his friends. Elliot continued on, feeling the faint ache in his knees. Age wasn't cruel, he thought. It was just persistent. His house sat at the edge of town, white paint peeling, porch sagging slightly. He'd lived there for 32 years, long enough for the floors to remember his footsteps. Inside, the rooms were quiet but not lonely. Books lined the walls in soft, uneven towers. A kettle waited on the stove. He poured water, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out at the garden. It was a small patch of earth, nothing remarkable. Tomatoes, lavender, a stubborn rosebush that refused to bloom. But it was his. He took a notebook from the drawer. Its pages were filled with fragments, thoughts, half-formed essays, sentences that began somewhere and ended nowhere. He wrote, "They say I failed because I never published, but I never saw wisdom as something you print. I saw it as something you live quietly, like tending soil." He closed the notebook. He didn't need to prove anything. That evening, he walked to the lake. The sun had slipped behind the trees, leaving a bruised light on the water. An old couple sat on a bench, sharing a thermos. He nodded to them. They nodded back. That was all. The shared understanding of people who have nothing to prove anymore. He stood at the edge of the dock, hands in his pockets, and listened to the small waves. The sound was steady, patient, like breathing. He thought of all the people who'd told him he'd wasted his life. His brother, his colleagues, even his late wife, Mary Ann. "Elliot," she'd once said, "you could have been someone." He'd smiled. "I already am." She'd sighed, that slow, disappointed sigh that used to fill the room with silence. He had loved her deeply, even in her disapproval. Back home, the phone rang. He let it ring twice before answering. "Dad, His daughter's voice, Rachel. LA, production company, always busy. Hello, sweetheart. You retired today, right? How'd it go? It went. That's all. Well, they didn't throw roses at my feet, if that's what you mean. She laughed softly. I just wanted to call. Make sure you're okay. I'm fine. Pause. Then, Mom would have wanted you to do something with your time now. Travel. Write that book she always said you should write. Yes, he said. She would have. Will you? He looked around the quiet room, at the fading light through the curtains. Maybe, he said. After they hung up, he sat there for a long time, the dial tone humming faintly. He wasn't lonely. He was listening to the space where her voice had been. That night, he dreamed of his classroom. The desks were empty, but sunlight filled the room. On the board, written in chalk, were the words, "You are not your audience's applause." He woke with tears on his face, though he couldn't have said why. The next morning, he decided to walk into town. The bookstore near the post office was still there, a stubborn relic. Inside, the bell jingled. The owner, Mrs. Penfold, looked up. Professor Crane, haven't seen you in ages. I've been busy not being busy, he said. She laughed. Still teaching philosophy? No, I've retired. Well, congratulations. For what? For surviving academia. He smiled. Barely. He wandered the aisles. The smell of paper and dust felt like home. He picked up a collection of essays by Montaigne, Old Friend, Old Comfort. At the counter, Mrs. Penfold said, my son had you for a class once. You gave him a C-. He said it changed his life. Elliot blinked. How so? He said it was the first time someone made him think about why he wanted an A in the first place. Elliot laughed. Then I suppose I did him a favor. You did. She smiled. You always did, even when people didn't notice. That stayed with him all the way home. That evening, he sat at his desk again, the Montaigne open beside him. He underlined a line. To study philosophy is to learn to die. He thought about that. Maybe he wasn't learning to die. Maybe he was learning to live without applause. He opened his notebook again and wrote. There is a kind of freedom in being forgotten. He looked out the window. The moon was low, the garden silver in its light. He thought of the rosebush, still refusing to bloom. He smiled. When the phone rang again, he didn't expect it. A voice he hadn't heard in years. Thomas Avery, former colleague, now chair of the department. Elliot, I heard you retired. How are you, old man? I'm alive, Thomas. That's enough. Thomas chuckled. Listen, we're putting together a conference next month on meaning and modernity. Thought of you, of course. I'm touched. Well, we'd love for you to give a paper. Something reflective. The old guard returning for one last word. Elliot hesitated. And what would I say? Whatever you want. Just make it sound like wisdom. Elliot smiled at the line. I'll think about it. Good man. It'll be good to see you back in the fold. After he hung up, Elliot sat in silence. Back in the fold. He wasn't sure he wanted to return anywhere, but he wrote one more line in his notebook. Maybe I'll speak, not to be heard, but to remember how to speak. Outside, the wind rose. The house creaked softly, as if breathing with him. He sat there long after midnight, the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. And in that quiet, something shifted. Not a revelation, not redemption, just a small, stubborn peace. The kind that doesn't need to be seen to be real. He closed his notebook and whispered, Tomorrow, perhaps, I'll begin again. Chapter 2. The Invitation. The letter came 3 days later. Not an email, a real letter, thick paper, university seal pressed in gold. The kind of thing meant to feel official, important. Elliot found it in his mailbox, wedged between a grocery flyer and an envelope from the electric company. He stood on the porch a moment before opening it, listening to the quiet hum of late afternoon. The wind carried the smell of wood smoke from somewhere down the street. He tore the envelope slowly, like a man unwrapping an old regret. Dear Professor Crane, we would be honored to have you deliver a keynote address at the annual symposium on meaning and modernity. Your contributions to the department have left a lasting impression, and we believe your perspective would enrich this year's discussions. Sincerely, Thomas Avery, Chair. He smiled faintly at that last line. Left a lasting impression. If he had, it was probably on the furniture. Still, he placed the letter carefully on the kitchen table, beside his empty coffee cup. He didn't know whether to feel flattered or weary. He made tea, watching the water turn the color of dusk. Outside, The light was thinning, the first frost dusting the edges of the garden. He thought of Thomas, all charm and ambition, still convinced academia was a stage and every panel a performance. Elliot had never learned that trick. He'd spoken too plainly, questioned too often. That was why, when tenure committees had passed him over for promotion, he hadn't fought. He'd simply nodded. He wasn't a fighter. He was a listener, and the world rarely rewarded that. That evening, he sat by the fire with the letter on his lap. He read it again and again, as if repetition might uncover meaning. Then, as the flames settled into a quiet glow, he picked up his notebook and wrote. An invitation is never just a question of attendance. It is a summons from the past, asking whether you still belong. He closed the book. He didn't know the answer. The next morning, he walked to the cafe near the library, the Elm. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. The smell of espresso and cinnamon wrapped around him like an old scarf. Behind the counter, Nora looked up. She'd been running the place since her husband died 10 years ago, the same year Marion passed. They'd spoken now and then, mostly about weather, sometimes about grief. "Morning, Professor," she said, smiling. "Haven't seen you in a while." "I've been hiding from the future," he said. "Good strategy. Coffee, please." Black. He sat by the window, the same table he'd used for years to grade papers and watch people. When she brought the cup, he handed her the letter. She adjusted her glasses, reading quickly. "A keynote, huh? Fancy or desperate?" She smiled. "You'll go, won't you?" "I haven't decided." "You should. People need to hear you." He laughed softly. "I think they need to hear themselves." "Maybe, but sometimes they need someone to help them listen." He liked that. It sounded like something Marion might have said on one of her gentler days. He folded the letter back into its envelope and said, "Maybe I will." He walked home through the park, where the trees were half bare. A group of children were playing football on the damp grass, their laughter cutting clean through the cold air. He envied their simplicity, how the world, for them, still made sense. A ball, a shout, a victory. No questions of meaning, legacy, or failure. He passed the old fountain, its water thin as glass, and thought of how everything, eventually, slows. Back home, he placed the letter on the mantel. A quiet challenge, watching him from its spot beside the framed photo of Marianne. That night, he dreamed again. He was standing in a lecture hall, but this time it was empty of chairs, just him and rows of open windows. The wind moved through them like breath. He began to speak, though no words came. And from outside, a voice, soft, familiar, said, "You're not finished yet." He woke before dawn, the room still thick with that voice. The next day, he took the notebook to his study and began to write a draft. Not of a paper, of a letter. To Thomas. "Dear Thomas, thank you for your kind invitation. I hesitate, not from disinterest, but from doubt. I'm not sure what wisdom an old man who never succeeded can offer to those still climbing ladders. Yet perhaps failure is its own philosophy. If I come, I will speak about that." He paused. The word failure felt too heavy, too final. He crossed it out and wrote instead, "Those who are not seen." That sounded truer. He folded the letter, then didn't send it. Not yet. Later that afternoon, a knock on the door. He opened it to find a young woman. Dark hair, worn coat, eyes bright with the self-consciousness of youth. "Professor Crane?" "Yes. I'm Lily. I was a student in your seminar 3 years ago. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Come in." She stepped inside, glancing around at the books, the clutter, the quiet. "It's exactly how I imagined your house would be." "I'm not sure that's a compliment." She laughed. "It is. It feels lived in." He poured her tea, and they sat at the small kitchen table. "I heard you retired," she said. "I just wanted to say thank you. Your class changed how I think." "About what?" "About everything, I think. You once said that meaning isn't discovered, it's built. I didn't understand it then. Now I do." He smiled. "I'm glad." She hesitated. "I also heard you're giving a talk soon." "Possibly." "What?" "I work at the college now. Research assistant for Professor Avery. He said you might speak about failure." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "Did he?" She smiled. "He's framing it as a kind of redemptive reflection." He sighed. "Of course he is." She looked at him, her expression earnest. "You should go, Professor. Not to prove anything. Just to remind them that success isn't the only story worth telling." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're wiser than I was at your age." "That's because you taught me to be," she said. When she left, the house felt fuller somehow, as if her words had left a warmth behind. That evening, he wrote in his notebook again. They call it failure when you stop climbing. But maybe some of us were never meant for ladders. He decided then. He would go, not to reclaim anything, just to speak once, honestly, before the silence claimed the rest. Over the next week, he prepared, not formally, not with notes or slides, but with thought. He took long walks by the lake, rehearsing phrases under his breath. He imagined the faces he would see again. Thomas, the younger faculty, the students pretending to listen. He wasn't angry, just curious. How would they hear him now, stripped of status, unguarded? One morning, he found himself at the old classroom building, standing before the door of room 212. His room. It was empty now, new posters on the walls, new names on the schedule. He sat in the back row and listened to the echoes, faint ghosts of chalk, laughter, questions. He whispered to the air, "You see, I was never really gone." And for a moment, he believed it. The night before the conference, he received another call from Rachel. "Dad, you packed yet?" "Do I need to?" She laughed. "Yes, unless you plan to attend naked. I've given worse lectures. Please don't. I'm proud of you, you know." He smiled. For what? For going. For still showing up. He felt something shift in his chest. Gratitude, maybe. Or love, disguised as irony. "Thank you, Rachel. Promise me you'll record it. I want to hear it later." "We'll see." After she hung up, he stood a while by the window. The moon was bright, the world wrapped in quiet silver. He thought of Marianne again, how she'd always wanted him to be more visible, more successful. He whispered to the night, "This one's for you, my love." But not in the way you'd expect. Morning came cold and clear. He dressed carefully, old gray suit, slightly frayed cuffs, but clean. He brushed his hair, straightened his tie. In the mirror, he saw not a failure, not even a professor, just a man who'd outlived his ambition. And somehow that was enough. He drove to campus. The trees were nearly bare now, the air smelling of frost and wet leaves. In the auditorium, the lights were too bright, the seats half full. He saw Thomas near the stage, beaming. "Elliot." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "You came. I did warn you I might." "Good, good. The audience is eager." "For what?" "For wisdom, of course." Elliot smiled. Then they may leave disappointed." Thomas laughed, half nervous. "Just speak from the heart." "I intend to." When his name was announced, he walked to the podium slowly, without notes. The microphone crackled. The audience shifted. He looked out and saw a sea of polite curiosity, some old faces, some new. He began simply, "Good morning. I was told to speak about meaning and modernity. I don't know much about either. What I do know is what it feels like to be forgotten." A few quiet chuckles. "I spent 40 years in this institution. I taught thousands of students. I published nothing, won nothing, changed nothing measurable. And for many, that means I failed." Silence now. Stillness. "But I never believed in success as salvation. I believed in moments, small ones. A conversation after class. A sentence that lingered. A mind that turned, even slightly, toward kindness. If that's failure, then I've failed beautifully." He paused, letting the words settle. "I don't have a theory to leave you. Just a suggestion. Maybe we can stop chasing immortality and learn, instead, to vanish gracefully. To leave behind not monuments, but echoes." He looked down for a moment, then up again. "And if you remember me at all, remember me as someone who listened." He stepped back. No applause yet, just quiet. Then, slowly, the sound rose, not loud, but warm. Genuine. Elliot nodded, almost embarrassed, and left the stage. Outside, the afternoon light had turned golden. He stood by the door, watching students file out, their faces thoughtful. Lily approached. "You did it," she said softly. "I suppose I did. They'll talk about that speech for a while. Then I've already overstayed my welcome." They both laughed. She hesitated. "You know, Professor, I think that was the most honest thing anyone's ever said in that hall." He looked at her, his eyes kind. "Honesty is underrated." Then, after a pause, "Thank you for reminding me I still had something to say." He walked home as the sun began to set, the sky streaked with orange and blue. He felt lighter, as if some invisible weight had quietly released him. At his door, he stopped, turned once toward the campus, the spires in the distance glowing with the last light, and whispered, "Goodbye and thank you." Then he went inside, closed the door, and smiled. Chapter 3: The Visit. The morning after the lecture, Elliot woke before sunrise. Not from restlessness, but from the kind of clarity that comes after something ends. The house was still. A faint chill lingered in the corners, the kind that makes the floorboards sigh when you walk. He made coffee, stood at the kitchen window, and watched the first light spill over the frost-silvered garden. For the first time in years, he felt unburdened, not triumphant, just quietly right, like a page that had finally found its ending. Then, just as he lifted the cup to his lips, someone knocked at the door. At that hour, it could only be trouble or memory. He opened it to find Thomas Avery, looking far too awake for 7 in the morning. "Elliot." Thomas beamed, coat unbuttoned, eyes bright with the zeal of a man who still believed in conferences as salvation. "Hope I'm not intruding." "You are," Elliot said, stepping aside. "But come in anyway." Thomas laughed. "Still the same." Unfortunately, they went into the kitchen. Thomas looked around, at the books, the worn furniture, the small kettle steaming on the stove. "Just as I pictured it," he said. "You live like a monk. Monks at least have prayer. I have plumbing." Thomas grinned, sitting down. "You were magnificent yesterday." I spoke. "You did more than that. You moved people." Even the provost was impressed. That must have been exhausting for him. Thomas ignored the jab. "They're talking about publishing your speech, maybe in the alumni journal." Elliot sighed. "The world finally wants something from me. How ironic." Thomas leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Listen, Elliot. I mean this sincerely. You've still got something rare, authenticity. We could use that. The department's looking for mentors for our younger faculty. Come back, part-time. 2 courses a semester. No committees, no pressure." Elliot stared at him. "Thomas," he said quietly, "I gave my farewell yesterday. It doesn't have to be farewell. Think about it. A small office, the students love you. They love what they imagine I represent." Elliot interrupted. "Not what I am." Thomas frowned. "You're turning down a chance to be relevant again?" "Relevance," Elliot said, "is just a polite word for visibility." The silence between them stretched, soft but heavy. Finally Thomas stood. "You know, for someone who claims to seek peace, you're remarkably stubborn." "Peace and stubbornness aren't opposites," Elliot said. "They're old companions." Thomas laughed, though it sounded forced. "Fine, but if you change your mind." "I won't." Thomas hesitated at the door. "You could still write that book, you know." Elliot smiled. "I already have. No one will ever read it." Thomas shook his head, half amused, half exasperated, and left. When the door closed, the silence felt deeper than before, not lonely, but earned. He spent the afternoon walking. The air had softened. Winter wasn't here yet, but it was waiting. Leaves clung stubbornly to the last branches, as if refusing to accept the inevitable. He stopped by the lake. The water was gray, the surface smooth as thought. He thought about Thomas, still chasing significance, still afraid of vanishing. Elliot didn't resent him. He pitied him a little. He whispered to the wind, "I hope you find what I've stopped looking for." When he returned home, a car he didn't recognize was parked by the gate. A figure sat on the porch steps, hands clasped around a thermos. For a heartbeat, he thought it was a stranger. Then the figure looked up, and he froze. "Rachel." "Dad." Her voice was softer than he remembered. "Rachel," he said, "what are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you. Thought I'd surprise you." He blinked. "You live 3,000 miles away." "I got on a plane." "That's a very expensive impulse." She smiled. "You're worth the miles." He didn't know what to do with that, so he opened the door and said, "Come in before you freeze." Inside, she set her bag down and looked around. "It hasn't changed." "It rarely does. I thought maybe you'd, I don't know, redecorate. Start fresh." "I'm too old for reinvention. Mom used to say that." He nodded, not trusting his voice. She sat at the table, wrapping her hands around a mug of tea. "I watched your lecture online. Someone recorded it. You were different. Older. Wiser." He smiled faintly. "It's easy to sound wise when you stop needing to be understood. I think Mom would have liked it." He looked at her then, really looked. She had Marianne's eyes, that same direct gaze that made honesty feel like confession. Would she? "Yes, you were finally honest." That struck him. "You make it sound like I wasn't before." She hesitated. "You always hid behind ideas, Dad. Even when Mom got sick. Especially then." He looked down at his hands. It's how I survive. I know, but sometimes surviving isn't the same as living. He nodded slowly. You sound like a philosopher. I'm my father's daughter. Silence settled again, not tense, but tender. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. I found this when I was sorting Mom's things. He took it carefully. His name was written in Marianne's hand. Delicate, slanted, unmistakable. He felt the air leave his lungs. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he placed it on the table, tracing the familiar handwriting with a trembling finger. I didn't know she left anything, he said. Neither did I. It was tucked inside one of her old recipe books. I thought you should have it. He looked at Rachel. Do you want to stay while I read it? She hesitated. No, I'll give you space. She rose, kissed his forehead, and said, I'll be at the inn in town. Dinner tomorrow? He nodded. Dinner tomorrow. When she was gone, the house seemed to pulse with the quiet weight of that envelope. He sat for a long time before he opened it. The paper was yellowed slightly, the ink faded but legible. My dear Elliot, if you're reading this, it means I never found the right time to say these things aloud. You were always braver on paper than I was in life. I used to resent your quietness, the way you could turn inward and live there for weeks. I thought it meant you didn't care. I was wrong. You were listening, always listening, to everything I couldn't say. I married you because you made the world gentler. I stayed with you because, even when you failed, you never became cruel. That's rarer than success. Don't let the world tell you what a life should add up to. Some lives aren't equations. They're poems, unfinished, imperfect, but true. Love, Marianne. When he finished, he sat motionless, the words still vibrating inside him. He pressed the letter to his chest and whispered, You always did know how to end a story. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked through the house, from room to room, as if each memory needed acknowledgement. In the study, he opened his notebook and wrote, She forgave me before I learned how to ask. Then another line, Perhaps losing is only losing when you refuse to love what remains. He closed the notebook. For once, he didn't need to write more. The next day, he met Rachel for dinner at the inn. The dining room was small, warm, filled with the low hum of conversation and clinking cutlery. She looked tired, but peaceful. You read it? Yes. And she said everything I didn't know I needed to hear. Rachel smiled, tears glinting in her eyes. She would have wanted that. They ate quietly, the kind of silence that belongs only to people who understand each other's grief. At one point, Rachel said, You could come visit me in California. There's space. You'd like the light. I might, he said, but this place still holds my ghosts. Ghosts travel, she said gently. He laughed. Then I'll have to introduce them to the Pacific. After dinner, they walked along the main street. The lamps flickered, the air smelled of snow. She slipped her arm through his. You know, Dad, I used to think you were sad all the time. I probably was. But now you seem still, like you finally found your own rhythm. Stillness is just movement slowed down enough to hear itself, he said. She smiled. That sounds like one of your lectures. It was. They walked in silence for a while. Then she said, You're not a failure, you know. He didn't answer right away. Then, I never was. I just didn't fit their definition. She nodded. Maybe that's the only kind of success worth having. The next morning, after Rachel left for the airport, Elliot sat again by the window, the envelope beside his coffee cup. Outside, the first snow was falling, slow, deliberate, like grace. He thought of Marianne, of Thomas, of Rachel, of all the voices that had passed through his life like seasons. He whispered, almost to himself, I'm still here. Then he smiled, not because he needed to, but because it felt like breathing. Later, he went out to the garden. The rose bush, stubborn as ever, stood half buried in frost. He knelt, brushed the snow from its branches, and said, You're forgiven too. And as if in answer, a single bud, pale, improbable, began to open. Chapter 4, The Book of Echoes. Snow kept falling for 3 days straight. It wasn't heavy, just persistent, a soft insistence that winter had finally arrived. Each morning, Elliot woke to find the garden wider, the world quieter. The letter from Marianne lay on his desk beside his notebook. He hadn't moved it since reading it. Sometimes he thought he could hear her voice rising faintly from the paper, like breath escaping a seashell. He had stopped trying to do anything. No plans, no goals, Only stillness and the slow, familiar hum of thought. Then, on the fourth morning, he woke with a strange restlessness. It felt almost physical, as though the words inside him had grown too loud to ignore. He made coffee, lit the small fire in the stove, and sat at the desk. The house smelled faintly of pine and smoke, the scent of beginnings disguised as endings. He opened the drawer and pulled out his old notebooks, dozens of them, some cracked at the spine, others warped by years of damp. He stacked them in uneven towers across the desk until it looked like a city of his own making. One by one, he began to read. Fragments, sentences that stopped mid-thought, lists of questions he'd once meant to answer. Why do we remember pain more vividly than joy? At what age does ambition turn into nostalgia? Is wisdom simply the exhaustion of desire? He smiled at his younger self, the man who still believed understanding would save him. Now he knew better. Understanding didn't save anyone. It only softened the fall. By noon, pages covered the desk, the floor, even the windowsill. He took a pencil and began circling lines that still rang true. He didn't know why, perhaps to see if a pattern remained, a voice that still belonged to him. He read aloud quietly, to test the sound of them. The measure of a life is not in what it builds, but in what it tends. Loneliness is just attention with nowhere to go. To grow old is to trade visibility for freedom. He paused. Each line felt like an echo, not of wisdom, but of persistence. A voice calling from a place he'd almost forgotten. That evening, Rachel called from Los Angeles. Her voice was tinny through the receiver, softened by distance. "Dad, are you writing again?" "I'm sorting." "That sounds like writing's first cousin." He chuckled. "Maybe. I found my old notebooks. They're full of questions I still don't have answers for. That's the point, isn't it? To keep asking." He smiled. "You're more like me than you should be." "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is." She hesitated. "If you ever decide to publish them, I can help. I know people." "Thank you," he said gently. "But these words aren't meant for shelves. They're meant to keep me company." "Then keep them close," she said. After they hung up, the silence felt companionable, not empty. Days passed. Outside, the snow deepened. Inside, the piles of paper grew into order. He began to copy passages into a new notebook, thick, bound in dark blue cloth. On the first page, in small, deliberate letters, he wrote, "The Book of Echoes." Below it, he added a single line, "For those who listen after the noise fades." He didn't plan chapters or structure. He simply gathered what still felt alive, notes on time, teaching, love, silence. Each line a stone placed carefully into a small, private monument. One afternoon, Nora from the cafe stopped by with a basket of bread and soup. "You've been invisible," she said. "People think you've moved." "I've moved inward," he said, smiling. She glanced at the notebooks. "My God, that's a lot of thinking. Half a lifetime's worth. Will anyone read it?" "I'm not sure they need to." She nodded thoughtfully. "You know, sometimes I think the world's so loud now, people forget that quiet is also an art form." He looked at her, surprised. "That might be the best line I've heard in years," he said. "Use it," she replied. "Just give me a footnote." They laughed. When she left, the house smelled faintly of rosemary and warmth. In the evenings, he read the blue notebook aloud, softly, as if performing for ghosts. He liked how the words sounded in the air, how they shaped the silence. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, the way you speak when no one is hurrying you. Sometimes he caught himself imagining Marian listening, sitting across the table, nodding, half amused, half proud. "You see," he whispered once, "I finally wrote something." And in the crackle of the fire, he almost heard her answer. "You always were." Weeks drifted by. Winter held its breath. He began writing new pieces, small reflections stitched between old fragments. One read, "We leave behind two kinds of traces, what we say and how we made others feel when we said it." Another, "Silence isn't the absence of words. It's what remains when the words are honest enough to rest." He paused after writing that one, feeling something settle quietly inside him. It wasn't pride. It was peace. One afternoon, a knock at the door broke his rhythm. It was Lily, cheeks red from the cold, carrying a paper bag. "I brought you groceries," she said. "And curiosity. Come in. Both are welcome." She set the bag down and saw the notebooks. "So it's true. You're writing again." "Compiling," he said. though the distinction may be semantic. What's it about? Echoes. She tilted her head, meaning everything that lingers after the sound. She smiled. That's beautiful. He poured tea for both of them. She leafed through a few pages, her fingers careful, reverent. These are quiet, she said, but they feel alive. That's all I wanted. You should share them, Professor. He shook his head. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Why? Because some truths only bloom in privacy. She nodded, understanding. When she left, she said, if you ever change your mind, I'll help you find the right readers. I already have one, he said softly. She smiled and waved through the window as she disappeared into the snow. That night, he sat by the fire and read the pages she'd touched. Her fingerprints, faintly visible in the lamplight, seemed like a benediction. He added a note at the end of the section. The young remind us that echoes are only proof the voice once mattered. He stared at that line for a long while, then closed the notebook. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man finishing something, but like one beginning anew. In March, the thaw came. Snow melted into dark rivers along the road. The air smelled of mud and renewal. He took the book of echoes outside and sat on the porch, reading under the thin sunlight. Birdsong stitched itself through his words, a kind of collaboration he hadn't asked for but welcomed. He thought of Thomas, of Rachel, of Lily, of Marianne, each a voice that had shaped his own. He thought of all his students, the ones who'd left without goodbye, carrying pieces of him he'd never see again. He whispered to the wind, "Take what's left." The wind obliged, turning the pages gently. That evening, he placed the blue notebook in a drawer, beside Marianne's letter. He didn't lock it. He didn't need to. It wasn't a secret anymore. It was an offering. In the quiet that followed, he wrote one final passage on a loose sheet and pinned it above his desk. I was never a success, never a failure. I was a witness to time, to love, to the small grace of staying. He read it aloud once, then turned off the lamp. The house darkened slowly, the fire dying to embers. Outside, the last snow of the season began to fall, thin, silent, patient. And for the first time in decades, Elliot Crane slept without the weight of unfinished thought.